My name is Jason S.C. Fung, the host of Vanilla Club podcast. Today's episode is with Dr. Kathryn Robison. Dr. Kat is a lecturer in American Studies at the United States Centre at Sydney University and a senior research fellow at the Australian Centre for Space Governance. Dr. Kat's area of expertise is in political communication and its influence on U.S. space policy, both domestically and internationally. At Vanilla Club, we aim to simplify the complex, and there's nothing more expansive and mysterious than space. In this episode, we explore how space is far more than rockets and stars. It's also the hidden infrastructure underpinning so much of our everyday lives. We also learn about Dr. Kat's personal journey in this wonderful world that is space policy. She has an abiding fascination with the cosmos. We hope you enjoy the episode. Dr. Kat, great to see you. Thank you so much for coming on the Vanilla Club podcast.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We are all about simplicity. That's our basic premise, is not just keep it simple, stupid. It's keep it stupidly simple, stupid. So we have 3 S's in there. And this podcast series is centered on the idea that despite aiming to keep things simple, we still need to engage with complexity. Mm-hmm. And even as lay people, we need to have active, engaged conversations with people who are doing really exciting work in different areas across the world. And that's our basic concept here, and that drives this podcast series. So we're so excited to have you on because you operate in this world of space policy, of space governance. Mm-hmm. And again, I can't think of anything that's more complex, that's more open-ended, that's more unearthly than some of the areas that you talk about. So, we have an opportunity to just talk about a few general ideas, general topics that we could talk about to a broad lay audience, as I say. So maybe we can just start off by asking you the question, why does space matter?
Well, it matters because we rely on it every day. Each person 20 to 40 times throughout their day are touching something to do with space, whether that's the directions you use to get here, you use GPS or global GNSS, so positioning systems that talk to your phone, tell you where you are. If you bought a coffee this morning, that FTPOS transaction, that relies on P&T, which is position and timing. So it relies on really precise financial times in order to work. Calling someone, if you had a medical procedure, you might have had an MRI this morning. Those are all space technology. Space literally touches our life every day. And so it's just important. And in the same way that we have these conversations about maybe invisible labor, the work that people do that we don't see, space is sort of like the invisible labor of technology. It underpins so much stuff and is involved in so many things that a day without space would completely cripple our modern life. We wouldn't be able to survive.
And we take so much of it for granted.
Absolutely.
We take our bank transaction, right? I mean, this was one of the first things that Bitcoin had to deal with is the double payment problem, right? So if you now have a satellite that's somehow knocked off course, you could potentially make one payment, Wednesday, 1 a.m., 1 a.m. plus 1 second, make the same payment.
Even our farming systems, in the last couple years, I don't remember the exact year, but a GPS satellite was offline, and that affected the ability for farmers in Australia to plant because their planting relies on GPS. So there's so much of our life is reliant on space, and that's why it's important. But also, personally, I think the other thing that's really important in space is I think at best, humanity is curious and curiosity, and I think space ignites curiosity in a way that very few things do. You lay on the ground outside under a blanket of stars and you look up and you just wonder what's there, what is. And I think we are at our best when we're curious. So I think that's another important thing. So it's not just about, the tangible everyday things we rely on, but I think it's also important because of what it does for us as humans at our essentials.
And there's no shortage of pop cultural or science fiction references that you could go on. But it would strike to me that there is kind of a binary.
There is.
In terms of utopian versus dystopian, because, we could just take a sample, and I think some of it would err towards it's optimistic, it's humanity fully self-realizing. It's a chance for us to
Star Trek of
Star Trek, and it's a chance for us to reset some of the resource scarce conditions that we've had on Earth, and sort of break free of that and reorient, revalue so many of the relationships that we have on Earth. On the other hand, there are examples that we could talk about where things go wrong, or we just go headlong into replicating this same extractive or the same polluting or the same racist or exploitative practices that we've seen in human history.
And this is something that you hear me and also many of my colleagues within space governance and space policy talk about. We missed the inflection point for climate change. There's a lot of things that could have been done had we recognized, hey, we're here, and if we don't make decisions now, it's going to impact the future. We are at, or have maybe arguably already missed that point in space policy. A lot of people I'll hear when I talk about the importance of not replicating harmful paradigms on Earth in space, they're like, well, there's no one out there. What does it matter? Like, we can't colonize Mars, because this is one thing that we talk about sometimes, and I have a lot of conversations with people about this, as much as Elon Musk is in the news these days. But he's been a larger than life figure in the space world for quite some time, and a lot of us, myself, my colleague Dr. Cassandra Shearer, Professor Alice Gorman, have talked about this, that the idea of using the word colonize Mars is really problematic, because it's not about that there's people on Mars we're going to colonize, but it's that sort of language recreates those harmful things that happen on Earth. Do we want an East India Trading Company in space? And I think that we can all look back at history and say that when we have these practices that put the power in one or small concentrated hands, that's never worked out for everyone else. What it does, it concentrates wealth and power and prosperity for the very few, and then leaves others to sort of either pay for that wealth or prosperity or suffer from it. And so a lot of our concern is making sure that we don't recreate that in space. And what can we do to ensure that space remains available and beneficial for all people on Earth, regardless of what economy they were born into?
Absolutely. There was a New Yorker piece on Curtis Yarvin that came in, I think, like 10 days ago. And something that they talk about in the piece has to do with the fact that they make the argument that, Yarvin makes the argument that what difference does it make if it's a private actor who is activating certain governance policies in some public policy realm, because at the end of the day, they're doing it with great effect in their own businesses. Why wouldn't you have Elon Musk run governance on Mars?
I think that there's some good examples of this from recent history of why you wouldn't want Elon Musk running anything at the governmental level. But part of it is who empowers him? Like, who is he responsible to? Who is he answerable to? So one of the reasons that government works is because it has a mandate from the people. It has buy-in. It has responsiveness to the people. And if you have Elon Musk in charge, he has no responsiveness. He's outside of Earth, so he's outside of any sort of international or national framework, though the Outer Space Treaty does say that nations who are signatories have the responsibility for regulating their private citizens' activities in space. But on Mars, he's going to be so far removed from that that effectively that won't happen. There won't be regulation. And to be clear, I don't think we're going to see any sort of like functioning society on Mars in Elon Musk's lifetime, but we will eventually get there. So if we want that society to be answerable, to make sure that it has to care about conditions for its workers, make sure that it's safe, make sure that it's not polluting or harming the future Martian environment, right? Just because some people have more money and can get there quicker, does that mean that they have a responsibility to protect that environment? And what responsibility is that? There's a lot that we can learn from Mars, because Mars used to look a lot like Earth, right? And so if we go there and we're just there to extract resources or to be there, how are we protecting what that environment is and making sure that it's still available for everyone on Earth to benefit from, or everyone in our solar system to benefit from? So when you have someone who is not answerable, who has so much money, then they can make decisions that have these far-reaching impacts that they don't think of because they don't have the systems around them to think of this. We saw this happen in the Russia-Ukraine war, right? So Elon Musk stepped in to offer Starlink services to Ukraine because Russia crippled their systems. And so Ukraine couldn't use their drones or use their weapons to target because they didn't have access or protected access to the internet. And a lot of that is because Russia actually started off the war, the initial salvo. Well, I guess you could argue Crimea was the initial, but was an attack on a private satellite, Viasat, which then crippled Ukraine's access. So Elon Musk steps in, gives access Starlink terminals and gives access to Starlink, but then he starts making decisions about when and where they can use them. And do we think it's right? And this is a question for humanity. I think the answer is no, but do you think it's right that one man who answers to no person, essentially, or to no populace, has the right to decide an outcome of the war? And that, I think, is something that people have to sit with and think about. And we put a lot of power in the hands of corporations anyway. When it comes to space, which impacts so much of our day-to-day life, and any resources that we might extract, especially from asteroids, and bring back on space are worth so much money that they actually have the ability to disrupt Earth's economy. Should that power be regulated in some fashion by the people? And the way that the people regulate power is through representative government. And so Elon Musk is a citizen of representative governments. So we hope that we pass laws and regulations that are smart enough that they can regulate while allowing for innovation. And that's the balance that we try to strike in space policy. And we sometimes, go one way or the other, and we certainly don't have that balance perfect right now.
And to be clear, that it's the asteroid mining that you're referring to,
yes.
right? Whereby, you could have tons of platinum or gold or whatever it
Rare
is.
earth minerals, which are so
minerals,
important right now.
Right. Technologically, we're a little bit far away from being able to, conduct significant asteroid mining, right? These are currently more like micro meteorite type things, yeah. But it's conceivable that we could take down something much larger that, as you said, could have it could yeah. take the silver market or the platinum market and just blow it out of the water.
Well, the implications for democratic peace theory, for international political economy are quite significant. It's funny to sort of talk about this idea of dystopian versus utopian. So when I wrote my dissertation, one article I focused on is what's going to be the new paradigm in international relations in space. What happens once we're actually living and working in space in the way that we're imagining now? And what happens to the winners and losers in that? What happens to smaller nations who might not have access to space? What happens to private corporations? And I use, this idea of are we going to be looking at the past? Do we have the Star Wars-like future? Because Star Wars is actually about the past. I think it's a long, long time ago. But it is sort of the history of humanity, right? We were always sort of been this conquering, colonizing force. Or do we have a more ideal future that's like that Star Trek, that there is equality, no need for money in that same way? Although obviously there's still strife in that universe for all the nerds like me who love Star Trek. But there are implications when you disrupt economies, when you have that much wealth. It is going to impact everyone from the people in the country or the company that owns that wealth all the way down to people in, Micro-Polynesia. And so the decisions that we make now about how we regulate our activities in space will impact how people on Earth benefit from those activities. And so we need to make sure that that regulation looks forward to the future. I talked about earlier about missing that inflection point for climate change. We're at that point right now for space policy, and the decisions that we make now, while no one's going to be able to go up and do sort of a deep impact asteroid mining thing right now, we just don't have that technology yet. It is coming. Technology is speeding up. The rate of innovation is accelerating. We will be there. Not in my lifetime, probably not in anyone's lifetime listening to this podcast, but in our grandchildren's lifetime, they could see that. And so it's important that we make the decisions that will benefit them. And that's why when we talk about private companies or private individuals in space, what they think about space is important. Many of those space billionaires are subscribers to this philosophy called long-termism, which is about the importance of propagating humanity into the solar system and regardless of the future of Earth. So they might care less about climate change because as long as we can get people off of Earth and humanity survives, it doesn't matter. But what that means is because they're so focused on this future of humanity surviving, they forget the people that are here and now that are in need and in help. And that's the wonderful thing about space. A lot of the innovations that we have to make humanity survive in this incredibly harsh environment that will kill you in a heartbeat actually benefit so many people on Earth because we can take that technology about how we grow food in harsh conditions and take that to a famine-stricken nation, right? How do we treat a blood clot that happens tens of thousands of kilometers away from medical care? We can take that into rural communities and we can actually help people. So it's so important that we invest in this because the benefits that space pays back on Earth are just, they're immeasurable in some ways. There's so much. The money that we invest in space, at a minimum, is a threefold return. But in a lot of estimates, if you look at the Apollo program, the estimate is something like for every dollar the U.S. government spent on the Apollo program, they got something like $45 in return on economic investment. So sort of a broad-ranging answer there, but it's a really important thing to think about how we go into space because it does impact us on Earth and it will continue to impact us on Earth.
So like Velcro, right?
Yeah.
Or MRIs, right?
Ballpoint pens.
Ballpoint pens, right. The toilets you see on the aircraft, right? The vacuum seal.
Those Nissan uses zero-G gravity-inspired seats in their cars. So like, how do you make long car rides more comfortable? You know, it's sort of incredible.
So just picking up a little bit on that topic of propagating, right, and propagating humans, right? Like, and again, it's so interesting about this like interplay between like the past and present and the future, because if you think about Australia, and you think about European settlers, you know, in the early days, the legal basis for what they were doing was terra nullius.
Yes.
Right. Which again, in recent memory, right, you contrast terra nullius with then the Mabo decision, and again, in the old days, they're saying no. There's obviously evidence. Okay, let's not acknowledge it, but we're just going to not count these people.
Yeah.
Right, and they don't count. And then humanity decided, no, we're gonna do something different. So I wanted to try to draw a parallel to the space discussion, whereby once we start propagating people in space, right? Once we have, you know, the first someone is born on a spaceship, right? I mean, does that change things? Is it now no longer a terra nullius?
I think that's an interesting question. I always think about it from the point is that evolutionary pressures are really amazing. If we start having people born in space, how long before they no longer consider themselves Earthlings or humans? Because if you're born in microgravity, or you're born in Mars, or you're born somewhere else, that's going to exert pressures on you. You are going to look different. You are going to act different. You are going to develop differently in that environment. So how long do you consider yourself human? Or probably still human, but how long do you consider yourself an Earthling and not a Martian or a spaceling? I don't know what a person born in space is. But, we don't know whether there's intelligent life that's contactable out there. I think it would be the height of hubris to assume there's not intelligent life somewhere, but the universe is vast and it takes really long to travel. And in order for us to find intelligent life, they would have to be significantly far more advanced than we are to find us, because we don't have the speed to travel to find anyone in our neighborhood anytime soon. But I don't think we can assume that space is terra nullius. We can't make that assumption. There is almost certainly microbial life in our solar system. We haven't found it yet, but we're probably going to find it on the icy moons, right? We're probably going to, in our lifetime, have evidence of some sort of life within our solar system. What right do they have to their environment, right? Because if you think about evolution, what do we come from? What happens to that environment in the next 3 billion years? What right do we have to protect that? I think it's really important in these situations that we take lessons from people who have been around for a really long time and who understand these. There's this really excellent book called Sky Country by Carly Noon and Krista DiNapoli, who are First Nations people in Australia who are astronomers. And they write about this experience of growing up in Australia as someone from an Indigenous background, but also the experience of loving space and stars and studying that and sort of the interplay of that. And they speak so beautifully and so eloquently and passionately about the importance of protecting sky country. And I think when we go out into space, we need to recognize that we don't own space, right? That's not ours. That's something that's outside of us. And so when you don't own something, you need to treat it with respect, right? When that's not yours, you need to act as a guest in the house. That doesn't mean you can't use it. You can't, you can go to a friend's house, use their restroom, use their kitchen. That's totally fine, but you treat it with respect. We can go to another planet, we can use their stuff, we can even build a house there, but we need to make sure we do that with respect. And I think that's what a lot of people within the policy field want to happen in space. We want it to be able to be utilized, and we want humanity to benefit from it. And we want to push the boundaries of what humans can do, but we want it to be done with respect for the environment. And with the respect to ensure that future generations are able to enjoy it, that we're not polluting the space environment, that we're not making it unusable, that we're not ruining the night sky and putting up so many satellites that you can't watch the night sky without seeing constellations of satellites go by every minute or two. We have to have some respect for that environment. And I think that's a really important just tenet for how we operate in our everyday lives, but also how we should operate in space.
So you're a lecturer at the U.S. Studies Center here at Sydney University. You're a senior research fellow at the Australian Centre for Space Governance. Podcaster, amongst many other things. How did you, Dr. Kat, get excited about space? What's your story?
So it's sort of an interesting and somewhat sad story. My first birthday, so now everyone can figure out how old I am, was the shuttle Challenger explosion happened on my first birthday. So I grew up every year on my birthday hearing about, because they mark it in the news, about these 7 astronauts who lost their lives because of a failed O-ring. It was too cold to launch on that day. The O-rings were brittle, and it exploded, I think, 72 seconds into their flight. And that was a really touching flight because it also had Teacher in Space, Krista McCauliffe, on it. And so school children around the country were watching. I have a friend of mine who I met through doing NASA tweet-ups back when, it was NASA tweet-ups and not socials. And to this day, when he talks about it, he was in school, I think like second or grade or something, he gets tears in his eyes because it hit him so much. And so every year I grow up on that. When the museum first opened in Washington, D.C., it was in Arlington, they actually brought Walter Cronkite out. And they had like a school child, I think I was in 6th or 7th grade or something. And they had a big Challenger exhibit there. And so I'd asked him a question about covering the Challenger. And all the kids submitted questions, but they answered mine. So I had this really interesting experience of getting to be a 6th grader and asking Walter Cronkite a question. But that just had such an impact on my life that I always thought about space. And when I was in undergrad, I actually was studying human evolution. I was really interested in how we walked, like how bipedal walking happened. And I also had another completely separate degree in Near Eastern Studies where I studied Turkish and Middle Eastern nationalism. And so and I intended to go into grad school in anthropology. I wanted to study, I was really interested in osteology and like the formation of bones and how the pressures of bones impact the way that we walk. Really interested in cognition, like how humans began to think of themselves as individuals. But I was in a faith community and people are always like, oh, why are you studying evolution? That's not true. And I had never seen a disconnect between my faith and science. And that really got me interested in science communication. And so when I did my master's, I studied science communication and curation and how science was presented in American schools, how we talked about things. And so then I was applying to PhD programs. I really couldn't decide. I was applying to history programs, communication, journalism. On a whim, as like I was worried I was going to get in, I applied to a political science program at Alabama because they like emailed me. They're like, you had a really high GRE score. We'll waive your admission fee. And the only program still accepting applications was political science. I was like, okay, yeah, I'll apply. I got into 5 different programs, and I visited Alabama where I did my PhD. And
Roll Tide.
Yeah, Roll Tide. And who became my advisor, Derek Frazier, he said, well, really, science communication is just political communication. And he got me really excited about my work in a way that like no one else I had visited did. And I got into this like a really great program, American Cultural Studies at the Ohio University, which is like the 3rd top program in the country. And we're like so excited, and they were really courting me, and they're like, we really want you to come here. But I was just so excited about this question of like, well, science communication is political communication. And then about 6 months, so I decided to go there. About 6 months into my PhD, my advisor said, he's like, every example you give me is space. Is there a reason you're not doing space policy? And I was like, no. And so I focused on the role of political communication or in the formation and dissemination of space policy domestically in the US and internationally. So essentially, I just looked at how do politics impact the way we go to, use, and talk about space. So that's how I really got into it. So from the loss of a crew to a career where I'm advocating for the responsible use of space and for the importance of space in everyday lives. And I think it's, I hope that Krista sort of looks down and can be proud of all that she's inspired, because I know that crew particularly really inspired a lot of people. And just the response to how NASA as an organization reacted to that, the lessons they learned and the ones that they didn't, because then we had Columbia happen. And I now look at companies that are pushing into space and I think, are we recreating that same atmosphere that led to those earlier disasters? Because space is really hard. If you ask anyone who's in space, they're going to tell you it is hard to get to space. It is expensive. It's extremely risky. It's not a question of if someone dies, it's when. It's just, that's how it is. It's so hard. But that doesn't mean we have to take unnecessary risk. We have to take risks to innovate, to explore, but we can do them in a safe way. We can do them in a way that minimizes as much as possible the possibility of hurting other people. So that's what I really try to advocate for, because I think, we need to do things responsibly, and we have the ability to do it if we take a moment to pause and reflect and say, what are the actual outcomes of this? What happens when we don't listen to those voices who are speaking up, trying to advocate for more safety? The engineer who tried to bring up this O-ring issue, there's a really great documentary on him I recommend. It's on Netflix to watch on the Challenger. So it'll make you angry and sad and proud. But he went, on his deathbed, essentially was still so upset because he felt like I could have done something more to advocate. And you might have heard Chris Hadfield, who's a Canadian astronaut, he talks about this in relation to the Columbia. He's like, these were my friends. And he's like, there was concern. People were concerned about this foam strike. And he's like, I had a high enough profile. If I had called someone, could I have, done something? And it was a really rare situation where there was another shuttle in prep that they actually probably could have done a rescue mission. So like all these what ifs plague people. But I think it's important to have these conversations. And I think I think about these what ifs in relation to space, because I'm like, what if we don't put this in place? What is humanity going to look like in 150, 200, 300 years when we're actually living and working and using space every day? Are we going to look like those dystopian shows that give me too much stress to watch? And I think that's a lot of us who are in space were inspired. Like, I grew up during like the Dana Scully effect. So many women went into science and science fields because of seeing Dana Scully on the X-Files.
Right, okay.
And so I think of like, what can I do to impact the future? And space is just so essential to our life that if I can make a small change and advocate to the right people in space, then hopefully I can also have a small impact as well.
Thank you for that. That's there's a lot to unpack in that. That's great. And again, Krista was not an astronaut, right?
No.
Which is it's in today's sort of OSHA world, compliance. It's hard to imagine on a SpaceX or a Blue Origin flight or something like that to have someone as part of the core crew. She was.
Yeah, she went through the training.
She went through the training,
Yeah.
but she was not an astronaut.
No, she was not an astronaut.
Right. And again, there's so many different story angles, right? In that incident, and I guess, was it the temperature? It was the ambient.
So it was cold.
It was
and
cold,
so
right.
the O-ring was made of this sort of material that became very brittle in the cold. And so what happened is it couldn't stand up to the stresses of the launch. So you enter what's called max Q, or the point at which the stress of gravity, like trying to break free of gravity, essentially becomes so much that if any one component fails, and there's not a fail-safe or a backup to it, then that's it, you've lost the mission. There was no escape hatch, right? Now, there's actually, like in the Dragon space capsule, or even in the Boeing Starliner, there are actually abort systems, crew abort systems. So if something, because you're essentially sitting on top of a missile, right? That's all a spaceship, that's all a rocket is, right? That's all, the shuttles were strapped to missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Like, anyone who tells you that space is shouldn't be militarized hasn't read history, because space has been militarized from the very beginning. It's been politicized from the very beginning. ICBMs, we hear about them in the news all the time with, what country is getting them or who's using this. But essentially that's what space programs came from, developing these ballistic missiles. So you're essentially on top of a missile when you're going to space. Now, the newer systems are mandating crew abort systems, so that if you get to that point and it's like, oh, something's going to go wrong with the rocket, the capsule itself can launch away and safely evacuate your crew. There's evidence that the crew was alive when they hit the ocean for Challenger. So, so you think about, people like to think of crashes, at least it was quick. It probably wasn't quick. They knew something was wrong, and they knew that they were just like a plane crash, right? We like to think of a plane crash as at least, but a lot of people probably know something's going wrong, right? It's not, the best you can hope for is explosive decompression and you lose consciousness within a few seconds. But how do we make those systems safer? So you might be familiar with the Apollo 1 static test fire. So they were on the launch pad for the first Apollo mission. They were testing it. They were supposed to launch after that. And a fire broke out in the cockpit because there was this pure oxygen environment. Well, there was an issue with the cockpit door and they couldn't get out. They literally burned alive. And so the controllers had to sit and listen to that. And that's horrible. Can you imagine? These are people who are your friends, and you know that there's no way to get them out. Because of that, the hatches were changed to make sure that they could escape. So when we have things like this happen, they're incredible tragedies. They're really, really difficult. But they don't have to be something that we can't learn a lesson from, because if we don't learn something from a tragedy, that's the true failure, right? Yes, we fail, and people lose their lives when we fail, but we can't compound that failure by not learning a lesson from it. So every time something like this happens, it's horrible, it's sad, it's heart-wrenching, but we learn something for it to make space travel in the future just a little safer. And so I think it's really important that we honor the legacy of people whose lives that are lost by doing better for them. And that's something that's, I think, important to a lot of people within the space community, that we know it's hard, and we know, people are going to lose lives. We lose satellites. Things go wrong all the time. But how can we make sure that we learn from that and that we keep pushing forward in a safe, sustainable way?
Right. And so it's really a matter of calibrating the risk.
Exactly.
Right. It's nothing is going to be risk-free. Well, nothing on Earth is risk-free.
Yeah.
Right. But it's a matter of not overextending the current generation of technology, not
Yes.
overextending the human capacities of the crew.
Yes.
And also acting in a way such that space governance, like these frameworks that you're working on now,
Yeah.
are somehow being, adhered to or at least, negotiated with, not wholesale,
Yeah. Well, the problem with a lot of these international frameworks, as is the problem with a lot of things at the UN, is that they lack enforcement mechanisms. And there are efforts, and I will say that, there are some efforts that have been led by the US. The Artemis Accords are an effort to operationalize the Outer Space Treaty in some ways, and so to set up some guidelines around how we should operate and behave responsibly in space. Australia is really uniquely positioned because Australia is a signatory to not only the Moon Treaty, which is around how we interact with the moon and how we go to the moon sustainably and responsibly, but also an outer space signatory to several other treaties. And so how do we make sure that we do this in a way that we encourage and incentivize governments to actually take that enforcement role that the Outer Space Treaty assumes that they will? So the Outer Space Treaty lays out that governments are responsible for what they do and what their private citizens do in space. So it is incumbent upon governments to have the right regulatory and enforcement environments to ensure safe, sustainable access to space. And some governments are doing this better than others. The U.S. in some ways has been a leader in this in terms of mandating that some satellites be able to be deorbited so they don't become space junk. There are ways in which I think that the regulation, especially on constellations, has been too light, or the regulation around Elon Musk's use of like Starbase and sort of the damage it's doing the environment around that. So we're maybe less great in that area. But you look at a country like China, which launches its Long March rockets over populated areas and sort of gives them short notice, like, hey, by the way, a rocket's coming, make sure that you're in somewhere safe. But, people and property can be injured by the debris from those launching rockets. So there are ways to responsibly operate, but it's incumbent upon governments to make sure that those responsible actions take place. Satellite tests, so kinetic anti-satellite tests where countries purposely destroy a satellite can contribute tens of thousands of pieces of space debris. So it's really important that we come to agreement at the international and national level about how we operate in space to make sure it's a sustainable environment for us and for the future.
So as a political scientist, right, and thinking about this governance, like what are some of the things that could go wrong? What are some of the things that we should be vigilant about and that we need to be, as informed citizens, trying to help our governments, push back on them?
Yeah. Well, I think space debris is sort of the big issues. Like, we should expect that governments are regulating their activities and the activities of their citizens in space to minimize the creation of further space debris, but also to incentivize people who are looking at ways to actively remediate space debris, whether there's some companies that are looking at, hey, can we actually gather space junk and use it for 3D manufacturing in space? How do we bring that down? So space debris is very important. There's this thing that we don't know when it would happen or would it happen. It would probably be a change that's called the Kessler effect, where there would be so much debris in space where we could no longer access or even launch anything because it would just hit something on the way up. We're probably not looking at that anytime soon. Like, you'd have to have like a lot of like things go perfectly wrong for that to happen. Like, something would have to explode and have to hit some other things and cause some other things to explode and just create an unnavigatable debris field. So that's sort of like worst case scenario. But damage to essential satellites can happen from space debris. Like, there's different size of space debris that we can track, where there's a certain size that's small enough to cause a lot of damage, but not large enough for us to track. And so it's essentially just, like a Russian roulette, playing Russian roulette in space. It could hit a satellite, take out GPS navigation. It could take out weather forecasting. So those are sort of, I think, space debris is that big thing we should worry about. And we should push in the same way that we push now on climate. Like, we should consider space as part of the environment that needs to be protected and kept, as pristine as possible. So I think that's really where people have a lot of power to advocate to their governments for, making sure that there's standards there. Space situational awareness, which is also part of that, so knowing where objects are in space, that's an important thing to make sure that we build up. For Australia, we don't have sovereign space capabilities. We don't own our own satellites, right? As a government, there's a few NBN satellites that are owned by Optus, but we don't have any sovereign space assets. We are 100% reliant on foreign data for weather forecasting, for GPS, so our position and timing, so financial transactions, 100% reliable on them, which is not great, because if we're having a natural disaster, bushfires, whatever, and another country faces a similar thing and they can actually task away their satellites from monitoring our situation to theirs, and that has happened in the past. So one thing, like here in Australia, that people can advocate for is that our policymakers at the highest level understand the importance of space and understand that we have to have some sort of ability to get our own data in these very significantly important issues around forecasting or GPS or things like that. We have reliable international partners. We work a lot with Japan, we work a lot with the United States, and they typically are quite reliable partners, but we've seen with the US has been less of a reliable partner under the Trump administrations. And we'll see what happens after this next administration, how the US becomes. But if you want to ensure that we have access to the data that we need to make sure that our country is safe, we need to have sovereign assets. So that's something that's really important. And Australia has a lot to contribute because we have very unique geographic position. So especially within space situational awareness, our ability to process data from space is unparalleled. We're one of the best in the world for that. But when the first Albanese government came into office, they canceled a mission, the National Science Mission for Earth Observation, which was going to be the Rolls Royce, like the standard for weather satellites. And it wasn't just going to do things for Australia, it was going to be a satellite that could do a lot of calibration and validation for other satellites and their data. So it would have been really great for the rest of the world as well. It would have made us a better partner, more to work with. And that was canceled. It was an expensive program, but it was valuable. We don't really have a replacement for that, and we're still, again, relying on that foreign data. So that's something that we can really advocate for. And then also, I think just awareness of the impact of private venturism, capitalism in space. I think people should be aware of how much we rely on privately held companies, not so much in Australia, but certainly in the US and other places, but how much we rely on individuals for data and access. Open source, especially open source Earth observation, like the military can use its satellites to observe at a really, really small resolution, right? And can see, can read logos on planes, like really small resolution. But private companies can do that as well. So there are several companies that you can pay several $1,000s and get a picture of a piece of land, like at certain coordinates. So just being aware, I think awareness is really important, like who's in space and what people are doing. And again, it's sort of that idea of how much of government is beholden to multinational corporations and vice versa. I think that's always important. And I'm not here to take a position on whether or not corporations are good or bad, right? I think that you can make an argument on both ways. But I just think that being aware of how space, given how much we rely on space, who are the big players involved and what data is there is important. And, people should make their own decisions. They should do their own research, but they should be aware.
So we talked about food security.
Mm-hmm.
There's a scenario where a country that is ostensibly very food secure, like Australia, no problem producing its own staples times 5, could be in a situation where, under duress, with someone twisting its arm, the John Deere tractors that are used for broadacre farming could be slowed down or, turned off in some very bad scenario. And all of that wheat and sorghum and barley that's just sitting there is basically unharvestable. So food security, we need to think of the definition of that, and it includes some concept of what's happening in space.
And it's not just about whether someone would physically attack a satellite. It's cyber attacks, right? You don't have to be in space to attack a satellite. You can just attack its data, You have to think of space as just not so much of its own individual domain, but as something that underpins and supports a lot of really important things. And that's why we need to be more aware of it.
And then you mentioned about, talking about the private sector in space too. I mean, if you think of SpaceX, my understanding is that to call it a public-private partnership doesn't go far enough, right? It's heavily subsidized by U.S. taxpayers.
It would not exist not for the investment of the U.S. taxpayer. And this is something that I have been, anyone who knows me I'll tell you, anytime SpaceX launches and people are like, oh, Elon Musk did something so cool. I was like, oh, the U.S. taxpayer did something so cool. I mean, to the tune of billions of dollars. SpaceX, there's not, I think sort of the thing that people don't like to say aloud, but is very true, is that there is not a single space company in existence, with the exception of maybe SATCOM, that can exist without government as a customer. And most successful space companies are essentially catering to government as a customer. So SpaceX without the US government does not exist.
So why does the US government allow SpaceX to take all of the credit?
Well, this is actually, I don't know why they allow it, because I think that there are people who do get out there and talk about the importance of the partnership, and that this is something that was done with taxpayer money. And even when SpaceX had its first launch, it was really funny actually, because it happened during the Trump administration, its first crewed launch, but and Trump tried to take credit for it or said something about it, and then Obama was like, hey, I started this program, this is mine, which is just funny when you sort of get to powerful men who are talking about their accomplishments. So I think that there's recognition within the government in the U.S. of the importance of the taxpayer investment, and certainly within Congress there's recognition of this. I think space is just not salient. It's not important to people, so a lot of people don't do this. But I think it is, when they talk about it, people should say it's a U.S. taxpayer investment, because they don't exist without the U.S. taxpayer. There's no Starship if not the U.S. taxpayer, even if that's not, now it's getting government money. But, SpaceX wasn't profitable until, they're private companies, so their finances are kept close, but, they've talked about it, and they said it even as early as this 2022, 2023, there were questions about whether or not they were profitable yet. So the only way that they stay afloat is the U.S. government contracts. So it is a taxpayer investment, but it's a good investment. It's a good return on money. It's been much cheaper to have private companies deliver to low Earth orbit as opposed to the U.S. government, as opposed to NASA. One of the reasons that this program exists is because for NASA to be able to focus on exploration goals, getting to the moon, again, going to Mars, they can't also run a low Earth orbit transportation program. So that's why the public-private partnerships, why the COTS programs, why, and this makes me laugh every time I talk about it, but there's actually a program, it's called C3PO. A lot of nerds, after my own heart at NASA. Why these commercial transportation and commercial crew programs exist is because NASA can't afford to both go to low Earth orbit and explore. So NASA has to choose exploration, so they have to pass these off to private companies. And private companies have been in partnership with the U.S. government and space exploration from the very beginning. So it's a very normal process in the U.S.
Normal, yeah. And then if you think about, like you mentioned, the Challenger and just how formative that single experience was for your career trajectory. Like you think about, again, as an educator, right? You think you have to think about, your students and the next generation and things like that. Like my sense would be a lot of people who went into space who were inspired in the 60s or 70s or 80s, there was a sense of patriotism.
Yeah,
there
absolutely.
there was some, each of those decades is a little bit different, but there was some sense of duty, imbued in what they were doing, and maybe that drove some of them, while they're studying, because to be an astronaut, you've basically got to be 10 different things,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right? You've got to be a scientist, a nurse, you've got to be a, engineer, a product manager.
And you can't be too tall.
You can't be too tall, no.
Can't be.
No. But it's interesting because you mentioned that, I asked you that broad question about what can go wrong, and really, you summarized it, talking about the sort of that private sector, or the sort of this specter of like rampant capitalism in space. And I'm just thinking, like, how has that changed? How's that dynamic change? I mean, is it now, like, with that profit motive, I can see how that could inspire, a certain subset of kids, but does that come at the detriment of something?
That's a good question. Does it come at a detriment to something? I think that the detriment is that there has to be an immediate value, immediate return on investment. And exploration and scientific inquiry and research doesn't always result in immediate benefit, right? But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, and that it's not useful, and that a very important benefit might come later. In the US, so broadly, political communication is part of a field known as political behavior, so how do people behave and interact politically. And in the US and in many countries, actually, they do these things called general social surveys, where it's every 2-4 years, sometimes every year. Tens of thousands in the US of people are surveyed and asked about their opinions on different things. They ask a couple questions about space in this every year, and they've done since the 70s. One of those questions is, should the US government fund scientific research even if there's no immediate benefit? Consistently, year after year, more than 80 to 90% of people answer yes. So there is public support for this. They also ask about the NASA budget. Do you think that the amount of money the government spends on NASA is too much, too little, about right, or no opinion? And a lot of people support, either say that they've got enough money or they need more money. Some people say they don't. It's less than that 80 to 90% for that, because people don't really understand money in government because they're such large sums. Like, we just don't have the ability to comprehend that amount of money, and people don't really actually know what the government spends money on anyway. But once you actually give program names to things, people then say, well, maybe we don't spend money on that, or maybe we don't spend money on this. But still, there's a broad support for this idea that it's important that we're in space and we do things in space. If it becomes that we only go to space if there's a capital return, if there's something immediate and tangible we get out of it that makes us money, that is probably what would concern me, because not everything in space is going to make you money. In fact, a lot of companies lose money in space, right? But in the end, it all comes out in the wash that it's usually a net positive gain. So that concerns me. But if we're specifically talking about SpaceX, what concerns me most there is the work culture. They still run in a startup-like work culture, and that is just a disaster waiting to happen. But there's so many young, mostly male engineers who are really excited about working for Elon Musk and all that he does. I know how his recent Doge flirtation is going to impact that they can afford to burn people out, right? So, and there's a couple problems with that. One, you have a burnout workforce. Two, you're losing institutional knowledge. This is a problem even within NASA, and it's been certainly complicated by the recent federal cuts in the government, is that there's not a lot of sort of knowledge transferability. People are retiring with no one to replace them, or sort of missing that middle. You get young people involved. within STEM fields in general, you lose a lot of women. There's a leaky pipeline for women in STEM fields. I go into space conferences, and there's not a lot of senior women, right? It's getting better, but still, once you get at that senior level, I'm 40 now. There's not a lot of other women around my age that are in the field. A lot of them leave. This is especially true in Australia. Australia does a great job in attracting talent. I can tell you, I've come in and I'm like, oh yeah, she came here from the US to work in the space. I got to look her up. She's back in the US. They've lost her because they just can't do this. Or they ran against sort of caring, like they either had a young family to care for or an older family to care for. So there's a lot of pressures facing women. Or they just got tired of dealing with the space bros, because I don't know of a single woman in space who hasn't dealt with someone questioning our expertise, sometimes even quoting ourselves back to us and saying like, oh, this is so-and-so says this. And we're like, hey, by the way, we're the so-and-so who said that. It can be a really hostile environment still towards women and towards other underrepresented populations as well. So that can be an issue within the space, because you lose that knowledge, or you don't get that diverse viewpoint, which is really important. One of the things that I love about the Pluto New Horizons mission, the one that did the closest flyby of Pluto, and we saw that Pluto had this beautiful heart, right? They had a political scientist on that team. He wasn't functioning in the capacity of a political scientist. He was an engineer, I think, at that point, but he had been trained first as a political scientist. And that diversity of thought is so important in technical fields, because technical people within STEM fields tend to be trained to look for a right or wrong, right? There's a right answer to this problem or a wrong answer to this problem. When you look at sort of the humanities and social sciences, we're trained to think there are many answers to this problem, and 2 answers can be right, or maybe there's a different way to look at that. And when you put that together, or you make sure that your engineers have that training as well, and then you make sure that your social science, humanities people can understand conversantly, like at least in lay terms, what engineers or scientists are doing, it creates this really fantastic environment where you can have explosive innovation, where you can have really creative solutions to things. But when you have sort of a company or a paradigm that sort of values this one view, this is the right view, that can be detrimental to that sort of diversity of thought that's really important for innovation and exploration.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to pick up though on, this idea of the patience, the patient capital, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if the US government is definitionally patient capital, right? You've got the tyranny of that quarterly return, right, on the private sector, which drives, again, this startup burnout culture, so like as we speak, USAID, just as an example, right? You talk about these cuts, is no longer, it's just gone, right? The Fulbright, my wife is a Fulbright scholar.
I just saw the Fulbright, although I will say the Fulbright has an amazing alumni association with a lot of connections on Capitol Hill. So I would expect to see some advocacy around the cuts to Fulbright.
Hopefully. But again, it's pretty alarming to see that the entire board just walks out. That doesn't really happen.
Yeah.
You'll have a dissenter or two or something like that. This is like, they huddled together in a room and said, okay, this is really bad. So I guess I'm just trying to like get an expert opinion as to like this patience, like let's look at it from the viewpoint of Australia, right? Like this is a perfect, like Australia's looking at this and thinking, okay, on one hand I have this erratic, like more and more erratic US. I'd probably culturally, historically, everything like that be there's much more gravitational pull there. But yet most of my business is with China. They are extremely patient, if anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
And their space program, the taikonauts, everything like that is very much ascendant.
Yeah.
So it beggars belief, and you're a great person to talk to because, as a US expat here in Australia, like my sense of it would be, this is just terrible. This is your best friends want to ride shotgun with you. Why are you doing exactly the thing to piss them off?
Yeah. Well, it's really frustrating, I think, to look at sort of what's going on in the US and seeing the lack of respect for soft diplomacy and the importance of soft diplomacy, while realizing especially this administration, which has such a hard stance on China, and they really want to combat China's influence because, they see that as a major threat to stability or anything. But they don't understand that one of those important tools in their box to combat that influence is those soft diplomacy. Because as we know, China is going around to people, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, and they have the money. They're offering infrastructure deals. They're offering this. They're offering all those sort of soft diplomacy type things or the tools in the trade to become partners. And these countries want to partner with Western democracies, right? They want to partner with us. But the U.S. is becoming more isolationist. They don't want to partner with us. Some of the allied countries either don't have the capital or don't have the ability to stand on their own and offer that. So it is really like when you're Australia, well, it provides an opportunity that we could really stand up and be a leader in the region and offer ourselves as the partner, especially to some of these Pacific Island nations that really do need a partner because of the impacts they're facing from climate change. So it's frustrating. For me, it's frustrating to watch because it's like, why are we just not recognizing just the importance of soft diplomacy, the importance of cultural ties, the importance of this? But then part of me is also like, as political scientists, you have to take a step back and say, yes, these are negative cuts, negative things that are having very real impacts. Like the U.S. aid is having significant impacts. Thousands, tens of thousands of babies are being born in sub-Saharan Africa infected with AIDS that would not be if the U.S. was still doing that, right? These are real life impacts on people. People are more likely to die of starvation. Like these, and they're significant. But we have to see what happens for the next administration. Is the next administration going to continue an isolationist stance? What happens to the Republican Party after Trump, right? Trump is a unique figurehead, and he has the ability to sort of force the Republican Party to do what he likes because he has a certain, even though it's not the majority of the Republican Party, he has enough of a consolidated base that he can get rid of anyone in power, right? He can primary them, he can make their lives difficult, he can do all that. So he has the ability to demand loyalty. When Trump is no longer the figurehead of the party, what happens to the Republican Party? If it continues in this sort of MAGA-like, then I would be concerned. However, I do think within Congress, within the U.S. government, especially within the bureaucracy, there are a lot of people who understand the value of the institutions. Even Republicans who may say things that appease Trump, behind closed doors, they're working really hard to save the programs that they can, right? So I think a lot of it has to do with what happens afterwards. Does the U.S. remain an unreliable, erratic partner? But you can't sort of claw back what you've lost in the last, several years, especially around climate change. I think for anyone looking at anything, the biggest concern is what the rollbacks of this administration do around climate change. But again, it's an opportunity for allies of the U.S. to step up and be that reliable partner. Because, China is going to continue its initiatives to become the leader, the leading power, the great power of the world. Whether that is able to happen doesn't just depend on the U.S., it depends on what two countries like Australia, the UK, Japan, South Korea, India, what do they do? Because they have large economies, they have influence as well. And I think that there's a lot of things that can be done to mitigate the damages that are happening now, but that doesn't fix the damage, right? Like there are real consequences to these cuts and these important programs. And as I said, people are significantly impacted by it. But whether or not that erodes those institutions as a whole is yet to be seen. And I don't think we can make that prediction until we see what a post-Trump U.S. and Republican Party looks like.
Dr. Green at the center had a really interesting stat that he mentioned on one of the YouTube videos that I saw, that in terms of the AUKUS opinion in this country, there's a massive gender gap.
There is, and
which
we
is so
talk about this
interesting.
actually a lot. There is a massive gender gap.
It's so interesting, and it's 20 points bias towards males who are go USA, and then the females are not as with it. And what are your thoughts on that?
So there's a couple things here, and this is sort of parallel with space, right? So like there's something called an issue public. It was put forward a concept by V.O. Key in the 1960s, I believe, that there are some people who believe so strongly about an issue that they'll vote on that issue alone, right? In the U.S., there's an issue public for space. It's young, conservative, male, high socioeconomic status, and those are the people who support space. They'll vote on just space, right? Defense issues and defense things do tend to be gendered. They tend to be more male supportive. But I think, and we're going to be doing some more polling around this issue because we are really interested in this gender gap, and we've talked about it. And it comes up every time we have a meeting about this. We talk about our polling about this gender gap and what we can do around that and why that gender gap exists. And personally, speaking on my behalf and not on the center, but I think it's just that women are two things. One, they're conditioned away from these types of interests from the way that we're raised. But two, they tend to value different programs and more money put into at home. So you might see that they would prefer AUKUS money to be spent on social programs. So I think that's probably, there's a combination of things. There's also age gaps too, that you see that the older you are, the more likely you are to prefer something like that. But yeah, I think it has to do with, one, social conditioning, women away from defense, science, technology issues, and then also from priorities around where do you want money to be spent, and not seeing AUKUS as a priority that's beneficial for them and their family.
Right, because I mean, even just I think yesterday there was news about, the U.S. DoD is now going to review this whole submarine deal, right?
I'm actually about to just waiting. Got a couple of surveys working through ethics right now. One is we're doing another iteration of our 2023 Public Opinion in Space survey for Australia. The other one is like an industry professional opinion on AUKUS. And one thing that we'll be asking about is whether or not we think the submarines will actually come.
Yeah, right. The 2030s. I mean, it's a moving target, right? Yeah.
Well, I remember, like, every time a government official gives any sort of things, I remember when Trump and his first administration said, oh yeah, we're going to have boots on the moon by 2024. I just laughed. I was like, anyone who believes that number is just, I was like, maybe 2028, maybe, but now I'm thinking like, they'll be lucky if 2030, to get there. But government time always is running on a different time than the rest of us, I think.
Would you care to share some cultural observations about Australians versus Americans? What have you noticed in your 5 years now in living in Australia?
I remember when I was my first year, I was trying to do something with CommBank, and they're like, oh, it's not a problem. And they're like, no worries, mate. And I was like, mate, I've got worries. I was like, there's definitely more of Australia is much more bureaucratic than the U.S., and so getting things done can be a little bit more difficult. My partner always tells me, he says, can you just go do your American thing?
Do your American thing.
And get someone to do something for you, which I do sometimes. Like I just had that with iiNet, trying to get our internet on at our new house. I was like, called them, I was like, let me have a supervisor. Like, well, supervisor can't help. I'm just like, but I think so Australians are very direct in some ways, but they're very respectful of the bureaucracy and the rules. They don't want to like push back on that. Whereas like Americans can be, myself is an exception because I am a very direct person. And from the South, which is usually a much more indirect culture. I think it drove me crazy as a child, so I developed I was like, just tell me what you want, like just be
right.
Like, so Australians are really direct and it can come off a bit abrasive. Doesn't bother me because I'm a direct person, but like the respect for rules and bureaucracy. So if someone like says, oh, we can't do that, they're like, oh, okay, we'll just wait, we'll deal with this inconvenience. And I'm like, why? Like you can fix this, just, deal with it. So I think sometimes that's interesting. What else? I mean, within the space industry specifically, there is like no tolerance for risk. Like Australia it's like the tall poppy, right? No one wants to be a tall poppy. So the risk averseness is like so detrimental to innovation and exploration. And that's really frustrating to me. I'm just like, take a risk or put your money, like the government doesn't necessarily want to invest. They want to like make it easier for private companies to invest in space instead of them themselves putting money in it, which is like not the best model. And in no way am I suggesting the Australian government should try and mimic the US, because they just don't have the money and capital to do that, but they could spend their money a bit smarter. And I think that there's starting to be some recognition of that, which is nice to see. Way more relaxed, like the work-life balance in Australia is so much better, right? It's fantastic compared to the US. I think I'm blonde, so the gray doesn't show, but if I wasn't, I think my hair would be gray by now working in academia in the US. I just can't imagine. The other thing is politics here are just not as like every day, right? You go to the US and you just feel like your entire life can be impacted. Whatever side of the aisle you're on can be impacted by politics, right? Like it's so in your face. Here, it's not as present. It's not like this everyday worry. And not to say that like different governments don't have impact on people's life, because I certainly think that like there are subsets of people, particularly our indigenous communities, that are really impacted by governments. And there's things going on like in Queensland, for example, with trans healthcare for children. Like there's some things that are really impacting. But for like a person like me, like my life isn't much affected whether Labor is in government or Liberal is in government. Like people always complain in the US to me. It's very interesting. They're like, oh, but your taxes are so high there. And I'm actually like, no, like I actually think I pay 1% more tax here than I would in the US. And it's like the benefits here are vastly improved, right? My take-home pay here is just so much more than I would have in the U.S. in terms of like the things I don't have to worry about. And I have private health insurance still, right? I pay for that, but I still have more money. Like we were able to purchase here, like a property. I don't think I would still be able to purchase a house in the U.S. So that's different. I think that it's a more equal society here. Like there's less income inequality. And again, not to say that there's not places and people who are really struggling, because there certainly is. I mean, we've got a cost of living crisis, like rent is out of control. One last thing I'll say, and I hope someone from the government listens to me. The fact that you cannot fix your interest rate on a home loan for the life of the loan drives me absolutely up the wall. Like this, I think.
There's no fixed 30-year.
Yeah. And even if they could fix it for 10 years, right? Like we talk about, this is not the topic of this at all, but I just will have my small little rant if you'll indulge me.
I will.
We talk about like what can we do to improve the cost of living for people? Well, we can let the bank stop making so much money off of average everyday Australians. Like my home loan, I will more than pay twice for my house over the length of the loan, and that is insane. And so something within that industry should be regulated and fixed, because there has to be a better way. Because it shouldn't be that just because of the interest rate that suddenly your housing payment goes from $2,000 to $3,000. Like that's just insane. That really is something that I will say, being able to fix your interest rate and fix your home loan at like, I've got friends who are in 1 or 3% loans at their house, in the US. They can afford that, right? That's affordable. We're here, some people are like 6 or 7% for a home loan. Like at that rate, your house, you pay so much for. It's just insane. So I think if I was a politician in Australia, which I will never be a politician in Australia, but if I was, this sole thing I would run on would be regulating banks and making them be more friendly to consumers, because they are making so much money. They can afford to let people fix their home loan rates for a bit longer, right? That's my thing. And maybe some rental caps, because that's insane too. But that's very different. I would say like that, it's just that is the one big difference. And I still complain about it. It just blows my mind. And everyone in in the US, and I'm like, oh yeah, you can't fix. They're like, what? You can't fix your, and I was like, yep. That's my,
wow. But most people don't realize it, but there's something like 9 million Americans living abroad.
Yeah, there's a lot.
It's a huge number, and the funny thing is, like, if you take France has a minister of the overseas that literally his job is to look after the interests of all of the French people, and doing great work all overseas.
Great if the U.S. did that,
right?
Especially fix our tax. We're like the only country in the world that double taxes its citizens. It's just insane. Like my poor daughter, like I've just, ruined her for life, damning her to U.S. citizenship, not because of the U.S., but because she's now got to pay U.S. taxes her whole life. Like there's a foreign resident like exemption for a certain amount of income. But imagine having to, even though you don't live in the U.S. or maybe have never lived in the U.S., if you're a U.S. citizen, you can be liable to pay taxes your whole life. And if you don't live and work in the U.S. for a certain, it's like 40 quarters, then you won't even benefit from that because you won't qualify for Social Security. Luckily, I started working very young, so I get my Social Security. But yeah, having to pay taxes is just insane. Like, which is another thing you just have to think about. All of these things. Being an expat is interesting for that.
For sure. Yeah, I haven't lived in the U.S. since 2010. Mm-hmm. But I miss California. I love California for a lot of reasons. Food, yeah, food. But again, that's the great thing about Sydney is it reminds me of California.
It's got. I always said it's like if New York and San Diego had a baby, it's like Sydney. That's like my opinion.
New York and San Diego.
Just I love it for that.
Yeah.
But I also will say the other thing talking about is the work culture. I really appreciate the work culture in the U.S. Like my first job here, it was like the way that they talked about their clients and people was just insane. I think it was sort of that, but even the first university I worked at here, that was not at a university, it was somewhere else, but it was a horrible workplace, and it was like shocking. I was like, I can't believe you're talking to me like that way. But there was my last university, there's a real lack of collegiality, and like in the U.S., like in universities, there's a real, like you do things together as a department. I will say, the one thing I love about working at the center here is that there is this like, and part of that has to do with Mike, I think, Dr. Green, our CEO. He really, like, this is a very collegiate, it is like working in a workplace in the U.S., like in the best possible way. Like the level of professionalism is really high, the respect is high, but like the camaraderie is really great. Like you come in and you want to see your colleagues, and it's really fantastic. And I know a lot of people have that at other places, but I will say within academia, and I've heard this from other academic friends, there's just this lack of like cohesiveness and collegiality within the university structure. Within Australia as a whole. But we really have that here, and I really credit that to Mike, and it's really fantastic to work at a place where you have that, and it's just something that was missing in other universities.
Is that maybe because they don't have sports in the same way?
It could be. I always think it's weird. People always ask me. The other thing is like in the U.S., like I spent like, how many, like 11 years of postgraduate study to earn my doctorate, and here they just call me Kat. I'm like, no one calls me like in the U.S., you call, like, I would be an assistant professor, so you'd be like Dr. Robison or Professor Robison or whatever, and I was just like, it was very like confronting to me when I first started. I was like, what? Now I don't care. I'm like, fine, I don't care, whatever. But it was, I had a TA in my first academic job here, and he was so sweet because the students asked me, like, one of my first times teaching, what's the big difference here? And I told them that. And from then on, he always referred to me, like, in front of the students or as Dr. Robinson. It was very sweet. And I was like, that's very kind of you. Now I don't care. I'm, like, over it. I've got enough Aussie in me that I'm like, yeah, no worries, mate.
No worries.
Call me whatever. I don't care. But that was really I couldn't imagine that. I was like, what? Like, how dare you not use my title? I spent so many years. I mean, the PhDs are different, right? You do a PhD here in 3 or 4 years, and there's rarely any classwork. In the U.S., you do 2 to 3 years of coursework before you even start writing your dissertation.
To get to comps, right?
Yeah, it's very different. Like here, the PhD is, you become an expert in a very niche area. Like you'll do your PhD, like if you did your PhD in political science here, which actually doesn't exist a lot as a discipline, it's mostly called government here. But you will do it on like one topic. Like maybe you look solely at democratic backsliding in Europe, right? In the US, if you do a PhD in political science, you become an expert in political science. You have to take a lot of graduate work classes in your major field. My major field was American politics, and then I had a minor field in international relations and communication. You have to take classes in that. And then you do these comprehensive exams where you prove you are an expert in the field of political science.
So you got a master's first.
So I've got a master's. So I actually have 2 masters. I have a master's in American studies.
And multiple bachelors.
Yes, yeah. So,
Wow.
And then I got another master's in political science on my
Okay.
way to the PhD. It was part of the PhD program.
The doggy bag.
Like once you pass your comprehensive exams, they give you like a consolation prize of a master's in political science. But you have to prove that you are an expert in the field before you even get to start your dissertation. So it's very different. So sometimes I'm like, it's just an adjustment of expectations. Like what expertise means here is sometimes different than what it means in the U.S.
Well, that was a really wide-ranging discussion. I love the cultural factors too. And again, it's something that we want to talk. I mean, I have a very multicultural background myself, being, I have one parent from Hong Kong and one parent from California.
Yeah.
So, I married an Australian. We live here. We love it.
Yeah.
It's an endless fount of humor, of inspiration, is the cross-cultural intricacies.
Yeah, my husband's Iranian and I'm American, so we have a daughter who is Australian, Iranian, American.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
So
wow,
we have a lot of fun, interesting cultural conversations ourselves.
That's right. Well, and then there's the intra-American regional identities too.
Absolutely.
Right. Which is there's a lot to that too. But it's been great making your acquaintance and really fascinating stuff. I think we covered some really great topics. Dr. Kathryn Robison, thank you again so much for sharing such a wide-ranging set of perspectives.
Thank you, Jason. It's been a real pleasure to have such a conversation with someone who's so intellectually curious.
Thank you very much. Until next time.
Yeah.